Emotionally focused therapy can be a powerful instrument of healing for couples and individuals. The therapist must use their own selves as part of the attunement. However, for many therapists of color, harmful social forces have silenced certain aspects of the self. So, how do therapists of color reclaim those disowned parts of the self in emotionally focused therapy? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sen. Today, we're thrilled to have Charisse Ferrer join us. Charisse is a licensed professional counselor and supervisor, a certified EFT therapist, and works with individuals and couples. Charisse received her master's degree in counseling from the University of Houston and a bachelor's degree with a double major in psychology and sociology from Baylor University. Now, from her couples therapy work, Charisse offers premarital counseling and even weekend intensives for couples. As part of her unique experiences, Charisse worked at MD Anderson Cancer Center with breast cancer patients, in which she interviewed them and their spouses to study the effects of stressful arguments on recovery and healing. Additionally, Charisse also worked with high conflict couples in a psychiatric hospital, both inpatient and outpatient settings. For her individual therapy work, Charisse specializes in using EFT to help people explore relationship with themselves and empower clients with the skills and insights needed for long-term emotional resilience and relationship satisfaction. As an Asian Filipino therapist, Charisse will be discussing using self of the therapist to continue to attune to clients in our clinical work. As often, therapists of color experience disowned parts as part of their treatment approach. Charisse, it is a pleasure to have you on our podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be part of the conversation.
The use of the self. Let's just launch into this conversation.
Yeah.
You've been doing emotional focused therapy for a while. I remember purchasing that book. And in fact, the theory and the treatment wasn't taught in grad school. I had to go actively look for it.
Same here.
Yeah. So maybe provide a little bit of background about this treatment as well as the intersection of this use of the self therapist.
Yeah, sure. So when I think about use of self, it's the intervention where the therapist uses their emotional experiences to normalize, support, and enhance the client's experience in an ethical way. And I've seen use of self as something that could go wrong, where maybe there's a very fine line with disclosure, where maybe use of self is just much more of a validation that a client's emotions are a humanistic experience and they don't need to experience it alone. And so emotionally focused therapy, EFT, is the model that I primarily use to give a roadmap of how I help my clients, both individually and in couples therapy sessions. So becoming a supervisor in EFT is opening the door to helping other therapists, especially therapists of color, to grow using self of the therapist. And I kind of want to jump back into defining what self of the therapist is we're relational. We're not neutral. We're not blank slates, as maybe what we were taught in a psychodynamic model, that there could be threats of transference or countertransference. But I see this within myself as a person of color, that I can't not use my cultural background, my ethnicity, my race to influence how I see myself as a professional and how I see my clients. And so I want people to be able to access this use of self of the therapist's work to continue to enhance their therapeutic relationship with their clients. And sometimes that could be a roadblock.
Can you say more about, it's hard for you to, I guess, do this work without seeing your identity as being part of the picture. Can you see how that plays out in some of your clinical work?
Yeah. So I guess maybe I can start with the story of how I got into EFT, if that's okay.
Sure.
And that how I can weave that into where I found myself feeling a bit stuck. So part of my certification process is of emotionally focused therapy. We had to do a lot of recordings, and you have to have a supervisor to review those recordings. And all that we were reviewing in these videos is the attunement. And EFT already lends itself to having a good base to learn about attunement. And when I think of attunement, I believe that that's defined as a therapist's continuous recognition of a client's emotional experience, leaning into that experience by making it known while possessing a curiosity and empathy to be alongside their experience, where maybe they have often felt left or dismissed or ignored by other attachment figures in their life. So while I was learning this model early on, I felt like I kept getting into my head about disclosure. I kept getting into my head about transference. What am I allowed to share? What am I not allowed to share? And it was just, I wasn't allowed to notice the emotions I felt in relation to their pain. And so when I was getting in my head about that, my supervisor would ask me, what's going on? You would kind of shrink yourself here. And I'd be quiet. I wouldn't know how to support my clients. And in doing so, I ended up replicating what maybe their previous attachment figures did to them, being so uncomfortable with their pain, being so uncomfortable with their fear that they ended up being alone in that experience. And that's so painful for them to experience in the therapy room when they're coming to me to not feel alone in that emotional pain. And so the more work that I did with my supervisor and self of the therapist work, this disowned part of me was coming up, of this experience of always feeling out of place growing up. And that is a lens into how I coped being a person of color, a minority in Southeast Texas. So noticing that, bringing into the room what happens to me, working with my supervisor, helps me not only to rediscover and honor my identity, but use that as a strength to be able to get closer to clients' painful experiences.
Yeah, it's like when you're learning this particular intervention, you already came into it with some prior knowledge and experience about what therapy should look like, just given how we were trained. And there's this sort of wrestling that you're navigating. Am I doing this right?
Yeah.
I can't, right? It's like, am I doing this right? Am I doing this wrong? And if I am so focused on doing this thing right or wrong, I am invariably, I'm perpetuating this idea of feeling different. And so that I can see how there is this drive to want to get it right.
Mm-hmm.
And the fear of getting it wrong is just actually pulling you further away from your clients. And
Exactly.
so, so I can see that resemblance of, your personal experience as a person of color growing up in did you say East Texas?
Southeast Texas.
Oh, Southeast Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beaumont, Texas, to be more specific, I guess.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I have some friends that just moved out from Beaumont, so familiar. Yeah. And so thank you so much for the illustration there and thinking about this use of self as a therapist in the clinical work. Now, give me some other, I guess, ideas or observations when we're thinking about many of our listeners who are therapists of color, and some may be doing EFT work, some may not, but maybe share with us some insights that you have accrued over your experience.
So I think this wondering if there's a pattern here, I wonder if I'm not experiencing this myself, to notice this disowned parts, because when you're examining yourself of the therapist's work, you are opening the door to your culture and your ethnicity and your race. And I guess maybe this has led me to wondering, is there a pattern here with other therapists and maybe therapists of color? And there's this curiosity, if this has happened to me, if this has happened to them, how did they end up responding? And maybe the ways that I tried to do that in helping my clients was continuing to navigate my own identity. And I guess when we think about EFT, there is continuous message of emotional safety that we're trying to convey. And when we think about emotional safety, it's hard to take people where we haven't ventured ourselves. And so we're relational. We're never not in relation with people. And I think that's what drew me to emotionally focused therapy, how couples, how families continue to connect even with rupture and repair. And that can sometimes happen between the therapist and your clients. There is rupture and repair because you are in relation to them in therapy. And that's where I wanted to notice my role in the therapeutic setting. How am I responding to my clients? How am I responding to this couple? How am I responding to this individual that can help them grow in an emotionally attuned way if maybe there's parts of myself that I haven't owned up to either? And so that led me to continuing to be curious about the disowned parts. And just to define that, it's aspects of oneself that a person has pushed away or actively ignored, essentially hiding parts of your identity, your personality, your emotions, or experiences that people might deem or you might deem unacceptable or undesirable. And so, I guess I just get curious there. What happened to this part of this person that I'm seeing in my office that led them to disown this part? And then what happened to me to disown this part of myself? And if I don't grow in that, how is it that I can carry through this work with them?
Yeah. You're mentioning something that's important, because if we are unwilling to experience ourselves some of the emotional pain, then it's highly unlikely that we're also willing to go there with our clients. And so in many ways, I think we serve as a container, a crucible.
Mm-hmm.
And so to examine, this is interesting. We really do need to examine our disowned parts, because that's what's going to give us capacity to explore those disowned parts even with the clients.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And so, you've worked with many couples, and we're talking about, mixed race couples, couples who are from marginalized groups, and you're also doing this EFT work with them. Is there anything else you want to share with our listeners in terms of clinical applications that you'd like them to know more about or think more critically about when doing this type of work?
Mm-hmm. I guess an example that's come up for me is knowing this disowned part of myself that kept coming up for me was feeling out of place was when highly professional white couples would come into my office, and I'd notice myself getting a little bit of anxiety around that I had this part of myself that felt had been ignored maybe in the past or discounted. So I was already carrying with me in the therapy room, believing that I might not be a helpful person to them. I'm Filipino, they're white. And so I just kept coming across this block that really prevented me from being attuned to them. And so that way of coping, of growing up and counting myself out, doesn't help me in the therapy room. And so when I notice this about myself, I think about my past experiences growing up. And this is the work that I needed to do outside of the therapy session with my supervisor. And once we flushed that out, I was able to come into the session more fully present, really attuning, like, this is not them about being white or privileged. This is not me being less than or unworthy. This is about this humanistic connection that everybody feels pain, and everybody feels pain in relationships. And I can't leave them there in that.
Yeah. Now, may I ask, this came up when working with a white couple. Did it come up when working with a BIPOC couple?
I think I was maybe noticing that I treaded water a bit more carefully as well. Also trying to shrink myself because of that adaptation of trying to cope, but also ending up shrinking myself and becoming misattuned and misaligned to the client, and feeling almost as if I didn't have anything to contribute to either case. And so I wanted to strengthen that I do have emotional experiences that are worthy, that have the ability to attune to other people. So it's this continuous recognition of whatever's happening, or whatever happened to me, or whatever happened to the client, not taking myself away from the present moment was really helpful in just continuing to tune in and to be curious. And disowned parts often at times has been a block for me in my work. And again, being part of this conversation is, leads me to be curious if other people had experienced it too.
Yeah. So we've used in disowned parts as a word or an idea, a concept. I don't know if EFT conceptualizes or talks about how disowned parts even emerge. I don't know the details of EFT. I'm not an EFT specialist. So I'm actually curious if you can elaborate more, maybe from just how you would define, or maybe share with listeners to pay attention to how maybe your disowned parts got in the way, or how did it even become reinforced?
Is it okay if I share a story maybe growing up in Southeast Texas?
Sure.
Okay. Well, when I think about how I immigrated here, I'm a first generation immigrant. I immigrated to Texas when I was 5 years old with my mom. We met up with my dad. They were both recruited as RNs to work in hospitals. And there's a similarity that I hear among fellow Filipinos and their parents, that we have a tendency for us to adapt and assimilate. And that's what makes us really successful. It's very much a strength, but sometimes a deficiency that can develop, or a side effect of what can happen, is this worthiness or belongingness in our own skin that we can count ourselves in as leaders, that we can count ourselves in as experts. And it felt like the implicit message that I received growing up was that I wasn't allowed to do that. In order to assimilate within the culture, I had to disown my Filipino-ness. I had to disown what I preferred, what I grew up with, like taste in foods. There was all these messages around bullying and how you had to hide this part of yourself is what I continued to receive. And I would just really shrink. That's the way that I coped. I didn't talk a lot about what I felt. I didn't share a lot with my peers, foods that we ate, where we went on vacation, how the Philippines was, what my parents did for a living. And that continuous side of me that I wanted to count myself out. It was all of my emotions, and that was all of how I needed to connect authentically with people. And so much of EFT is connecting authentically with people and showing up as yourself, using these strengths of emotions to continue to connect with your clients and to continue to help clients tune into these emotions to connect with one another in their romantic relationships or their family relationships. So this way that I noticed in myself, and maybe some of the ways that I believed my family was doing in order to protect themselves and maybe to grow in the community, was to disown this very integral part of who we are as Filipinos. And because of this work, this has also led me to learn about my culture a bit more deeply, and that we are relational Filipinos ourselves, are just relational people. We're always looking for ways to connect. And so growing up, I just disowned that part of myself. And then it was like a rediscovery of learning EFT that it just felt intuitive. It just felt like it connected in some way as a large part of who I am as a Filipino, being emotional, wanting to connect with others. And then EFT was just a model that I noticed that felt good for me to continue to attune to myself and to clients.
Wow. It makes you feel more alive.
Yeah.
Because in many ways, if I am excluding conversations about my experiences, my opinions, my vacations, my food, my favorite, I can't even talk about my favorite music. It's, oh my gosh, that's so isolating, so lonely. And so the idea of assimilation, which, we can get into a whole, separate conversation, is just not healthy, although it is a process, a developmental process that many immigrants go through. And there's a lot of pain and recognition in that, because we have to get rid of parts of ourselves in order to blend in. Yeah. And the other thing too, I listened to a podcast, I think it's called Asian American 101, and they did an entire episode on, Filipino nurses and, the history behind it. So I'm definitely going to attach that to the show notes just for context as well. So, thanks so much for sharing that history, that very personal history, and how that connects with your work. I am curious, in this path that you've taken, can you share with us any memorable events and circumstances that influenced specifically how you got into doing therapeutic work?
Continuing on this theme of disowned parts, is not only did I feel this shrunken self or always feeling out of place within the larger community, I also kind of felt a little bit like that within my family of studying psychology. I think that was my parents' way of being protective, that they didn't want to see me as someone who is unworthy in society, that it wasn't good enough just to study psychology. You had to be a doctor or a lawyer, engineer, very common threads here that maybe some of us have experienced. Is, the way that they were trying to protect me and saying, don't study that. I couldn't disown that. There was something within me that kept wanting to push for this learning about emotions, learning about connection. How do people rupture and repair? How do people repair when they get into conflict? And these are all things that I noticed within my family as Filipinos. We did have rupture and repair, and I wanted to see, how do other people do this? And how do I notice this rupture within myself and the larger community? How do I continue to repair that? And psychology was a way to study that for me. And I think as a therapist, early on, I think I would get this perception that I was supposed to be this neutral, blank slate therapist who had to stand back and know how to give the best advice to clients. But actually, that was kind of turning my practice on its head, and how I got into emotionally focused therapy, because there's always something that felt so stuck. And the message that I received in learning EFT is that clients aren't really looking to find experts in their emotions. I think what they're looking for is people to notice the rupture, to continue the repair in a therapeutic setting, and just to be alongside them when they go through something really difficult. And I think that's kind of how I come around full circle to learning about EFT, connecting self of the therapist, and disowned parts.
Yeah. And so, given the path that you took in your career as a person of color, or just as a person of color, what were some challenges you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
I think one of the biggest challenges was inserting myself as a professional or someone who knew what they were doing. I think that's something that I had been self-conscious about, is if I'm someone who is an expert on things. And I think that might sometimes give the message to potential clients that I'm misattuned, or that I get so nervous that I don't know how to work with them. But the reality of that is that I've been doing this for a long time. I've been practicing for a long time. And, I want to count myself in. I don't want to count myself out. And when I model that for my clients, and when I model that for supervisees, especially supervisees therapists of color, that they can continue to count themselves in.
Hmm. So for you, what does it mean to be an Asian Filipino therapist?
I think representation matters. As a Filipino therapist, going back to the roots of what makes a Filipino person's identity, and that has so much to do with being in relation with one another. It's not just about a community. It's about how I can relate. We call this kapwa. We call this how I can relate to another person. And there's already this intuitive heart there amongst Filipinos to say, I'm connecting with you in such a deep way, and you connect with me in such a deep way. And when people notice that, other Filipino people notice that within me, I think it makes it for a safe journey to repairing relationships moving forward, and not just with Filipino clients. I think all clients across a multicultural frame. And to possess that, I think is really unique.
It's part of your cultural values.
Yes.
So important. Wow. So how can we support you?
I think I feel really supported already, just being on this podcast, being invited, and being a part of this conversation. I think I also want to give the message that self of the therapist work is, you don't do that in isolation. I want people to know that, you have a community of therapists within this setting. You have a community of therapists also within emotionally focused therapy, and hopefully in other models that you can reach out to them to continue this supervision. Because I think supervision doesn't just end when you get fully licensed, or maybe when you get that next certification, but hopefully it's a way to continue this study of self of the therapist's work, continuing to repair this disowned part, continuing to show up this vulnerable way, this disowned part of yourself in this vulnerable way, and learning that there is a community of therapists of color who have felt the same and want to support you in that. And that's how you can grow in your use of self as a therapist.
Wow. And Charisse, you're available as a supervisor?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
For licensed professional counselor associates, and then also for people who want to get certified in emotionally focused therapy.
Okay, fantastic. Any final thoughts?
I'm just happy that I'm glad that I participated in this, and I'm so happy that you created this platform for people of color, therapists of color, to just continue to share their experience and feeling included, and feeling like we have a lot to contribute.
Fantastic. Again, thank you so much for your work and your insight. And this is such an incredible conversation, because we want to talk about evidence-based treatments. We want to talk about psychotherapy. And oftentimes the stories about how people are applying it, what sort of knowledge they've gained in their work and the journey that they've taken, oftentimes is not discussed and is missed. And so I hope our listeners can hear this episode and start thinking more critically about this disowned part of the self. A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Their feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.